All right, so the midterms aren't yet over in Georgia. There's a runoff coming up between Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock, who's facing off against Republican Herschel Walker. Voting started over the weekend. Election day officially is December 6th. Let's talk about it with Democratic strategist Calvin Dark, who's up late with me tonight for the first time on the Final Five, live to talk about it. Hey, Calvin, thanks for staying up late with us. We appreciate it.
Good to be here.
Let's talk about this because the runoff system is not necessarily it's not necessarily unique to Georgia, but really very rarely do we see these monumental races decided not once but twice. A lot of votes came in over the weekend here, and if you look at what traditionally early voter, you usually have Democrats showing up to vote early.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the increased numbers do benefit the Democrats. But one thing I'm just really excited about is the fact that, one, people are voting in a runoff election when the Senate is already decided. That's a big deal. And also, it's Georgia. Who would have said a few years ago that Georgia would be the state where voters would decide the control, or at least the power in the Senate? It's an amazing thing. That's why voting is great, and I love it.
Yeah, and when you look at what happened 2 years ago, where you had two Republican senators turned out on the day of the runoffs in favor of Raphael Warnock, an African-American, and Paul Ossoff, who is a Jewish senator elected from the South here. But when it comes to Reverend Warnock, there have been a lot of efforts by Republicans here to cast him in negative lights. They'll look at maybe evictions done by the church that he's a member of. They're trying to find these issues. Democrats have countered with many of the issues that came up with Herschel Walker. How is that playing out?
Well, I think that's what I call the hold your nose factor. As we know, Raphael Warnock's background is very well known, being a pastor of Martin Luther King's home church and his other activities. But then, there have also been negative things that have been out in the media as well, definitely, for Herschel Walker. But I think that what Georgia voters showed in the general election is that a lot of Republicans were holding their nose. They voted for Kemp. 200,000 or so didn't vote for Walker. And I think that's what we're going to see today, that both candidates have issues. But I think that Herschel Walker has some issues that a lot of voters in Georgia are having a hard time dealing with. And I think we're going to see that with the runoff.
A couple weeks ago on the show, before Election Day, I had former Georgia Congressman Doug Collins on the show. He was a Republican. He actually ran for the very seat that Raphael Warnock holds. He did not make it through one of those primaries, which was a pretty bruising primary. He said some of the issues on the ground, because look, we know that in midterms, Republicans try to make it about the economy, and he also said that Georgians wanted to see action when it came to Hunter Biden. He said that he believed that that's one of the overriding issues in Georgia, that we're going to drive people to the polls and drive Herschel Walker to the Senate. He did not win the count on Election Day. That was Reverend Walker. He was still under the threshold there. I mean, what are the issues? We talk about what a midterm issue is. What are issues in a runoff? Does it become a national referendum, or do you still run on those local issues?
Well, I think there are two parts to it. One is, if Democrats had not already secured the control of the Senate, this will be a much different conversation, right? I think now what voters in Georgia, and this is something that the Walker and Warnock campaigns are having to deal with, is the Democrats will have control of the Senate. It will be much easier procedurally for the Democrats to have 51 as opposed to 50. I know that's a great brunch conversation here in D.C. I don't know if people are thinking about Senate procedural rules in Georgia. And it's really hard to get people to go out and vote in the cold in December on that issue. So I think that works in Warnock's favor. But, just to say, with Doug Collins, for example, I think he would have made a much different candidate. And I think a lot of those 200,000 that voted for Kemp might have gone for Doug Collins if he had been the Senate Republican nominee. So maybe, we can look back and see what those choices were. But I think that says a lot about this election.
I'm inside of a minute left here. We mentioned about Doug Collins. He was endorsed by former President Trump in that election where he did not win that primary. Kelly Loeffler did at the time. It doesn't appear that the former president's going to campaign on the ground, although some Democrats seem to believe the fact that he's running in 2024 and all these negative headlines might work in their favor. I mean, as a Democrat, if you're watching this, are you kind of like salivating when you see these headlines come up, or is it still something that you don't settle until all the votes are counted?
Well, here's the thing. Donald Trump is a master at one thing, and that is running the news cycle. As much as Republicans and Democrats and independents don't want to talk about him, how much have we been talking about him since he said he was running in 2024? Yeah. It's not good for our country, because I think we do need to have both parties that are talking about what they want to do for our country. But from a purely political lens, it helps the Democrats, because when Donald Trump is talking, he is talking about what the Republicans are doing, and the Republicans are not talking about how they are trying to have a plan to move this country forward. Yeah. And from a political standpoint, that helps the Democrats.
Well, and again, we're looking at just the reaction from that announcement, and it looks like, there were a lot of people who were Trump supporters years ago, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 6 years ago, that are looking at Ron DeSantis, and that's another story for another day. Calvin Dark, I have to leave it at that. Hey, thank you so much for staying up late with me. I appreciate it tonight.
Anytime. Good to be here.
We will certainly probably enlist your help again when it comes time for the runoff. In the meantime, the Final Five is back right after this.